Welcome to Chapter 14 of the Barron's AP Economics book. My name is Dylan, and I will be going over what you need to know for the AP exam. Here's what you need to know for this chapter. You need to know what GDP is, and what the four components of GDP are, which include consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So this marks the end of microeconomics and the start of macroeconomics. We will be focusing on the economies of countries now, mainly the United States. It borrows from similar concepts from microeconomics, but you will find that macroeconomics is a vastly different field. Macro has very little to do with profits and costs, and everything to do with one thing, GDP. So GDP is the most important concept in macroeconomics. It stands for the gross domestic product. It's a statistic that sums up the entire economic performance of a country. The higher the GDP, it means the country is doing well, and lower GDP means the country isn't doing as well. It's a number calculated by statisticians who count all physical products sold within a country. It also counts the production of goods. This isn't which country's goods, but rather the country itself. If Toyota builds a factory here, that's part of the United States GDP. But if Ford builds a plant in China, that's not part of the US GDP. GDP consists of four different separate calculations: SIG X, or consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Consumption is the sum of all goods and services sold to households. If I buy a computer, that's part of consumption. If I hire a lawyer, that's part of GDP as well, and it counts as consumption. Investment is the sum of all business expenditures, including plants, equipment, and investments in inventory. If Ford builds a new plant in Detroit, that's part of investment. If Toyota comes here and builds a plant in, let's say, New York, that counts as investment. However, if an American company builds abroad, that does not count as investment. Here's a tricky one too. If Ford builds 100 trucks and sells them, that would count as consumption. However, if Ford builds 100 trucks but doesn't sell them, that counts as investment, and it counts as the expansion of inventories. So that's something you should definitely know for the AP exam. Government expenditures is the sum of all government purchases of products. If the government buys 100 fighter jets, that's part of government expenditures. If they build a bridge, if they build another railroad, that's all government expenditures. Lastly, net exports is the difference between exports and imports. Exports are goods produced here and sold abroad, and imports are the opposite. An export example would be Coca-Cola made in Atlanta but sold in China. An import would be, let's say, buying ramen noodles from Japan. So that's an import. And so the reason why we count exports is because exports are produced here even if they aren't sold here. And GDP counts everything that's produced here. So that's why exports are important to count in. And the reason we have to subtract imports because when we buy ramen noodles here, that counts as consumption. But they're not actually produced here. They're produced in Japan. And that's why we have to subtract those. And so net exports is the net number that occurs when you subtract imports from exports. Some other things you should know about GDP is that GDP is adjusted for inflation to accurately compare economic performance between years. A higher GDP isn't necessarily better because if there's a high inflation that year, that GDP doesn't actually mean that much. Regular GDP is called nominal, and inflation adjusted GDP is called real. Real GDP is calculated using the price changes of various household products from one year to the current year. And so the year they use the initial prices to compare them is called the base year. So if I'm comparing 1980 to 2014, if I'm using the prices from 1980, 1980 is the base year. So now some other things you should know about the GDP is that it does not count every transaction in the United States. It doesn't count what's quote-unquote called the underground economy. These are stuff like illegal trades. So if I buy heroin, that the government has no way of tracking that. However, it also counts stuff that's just done under the table. If I'm a babysitter and I get paid in cash, that doesn't get counted into GDP, and that's part of the underground economy. However, if I fix my own car, it doesn't count as GDP, but if I pay a mechanic to do it, it will get counted. So even though there's a value to fixing your own car, fixing a car, but if I do it it doesn't get counted into GDP. So the only difference between me and a mechanic is that I pay the mechanic to do it, but the value of that transaction is still the same. So if I do it myself, it doesn't get counted into GDP. GDP also doesn't count secondhand sales either. This is because the original year it was sold, it was counted into GDP. So if I buy a house now, but it was built and sold in 2009, it would be counted in 2009's GDP, not 2014's. And GDP also doesn't count financial transactions either, such as stocks and bonds, unemployment benefits, etc. Lastly, GDP doesn't count intermediate sales. If I'm a baker and I buy bread to bake a cake, my buying of the bread doesn't get counted into the GDP because the value of the bread is already part of the value of my cake sale. So it will get counted twice if I include buying bread. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something from this video.